Thank you so much, Dan. So I guess we'll start off with those three questions.
No, thanks, Dan. Well, first, for your appreciation of the report we did. I'm very glad that it is serving IFPRI's work. But beyond that, also that was in your starting question, it's also serving, feeding into our policy support to countries. For us, it's not a report just for knowledge generation, but actually to influence policy making. So we are working with the outcomes of the report to inform our support to countries and how to improve social protection systems and better align them with agriculture policies. Now, related to your first questions, I think in general what we're trying to do is to look at ways to bring the different stakeholders together. Typically, at the government level, the ministry is responsible for certain types of social protection programs and Ministry of Agriculture. We're not looking at to make ministries of agriculture also ministries of social welfare in the country, because they have to look at broader aspects. But there's ways to bring them easily together. So one good example that we do in a lot of countries is, for instance, to link school feeding programs to support to smallholder farmers. So by improving, helping them create through those programs access to markets, the way you set up the public procurement programs to buy the foods that are being used for the school feeding programs, and at the same time make sure is that the substance or the nutrients supply that go with the school feeding programs are also adequate for the children that get them. And through that also help, in some cases, directly that the farmers themselves engage in more diversified production through that in order to meet that supply. And in several contexts we've seen that also improves the food security at the farm household level, bringing them together. This is just one way of looking at it. We have also more aggregate ways to provide policy support, but I think the answer to your first question is I think the actors have to come together and talk more to each other, and these are concrete types of programs where you can see how policy coherence can work in practice. Well, I think I do agree with your point on so how would you want target transfers. It has to be tailored to the context, and also what kind of social protection scheme works best in which context. To give one example, when the Ebola crisis broke out, Sierra Leone sent us a request, can you help us implement a cash transfer program in the Ebola-affected regions and enhance it? And our first question back was, well, why would you want a cash transfer program? Because it may be counterproductive. If because of Ebola, which we've also found that food production stagnates and there's not adequate local food supplies, sending in more cash will just drive up the local prices of food and hence will not have the effect. So we first looked into that context and said, well, maybe a food distribution program is what's needed in that particular context. So it depends on the situation, but also what you asked about specific behaviors. Well, one of the things we've found, although it's people have different opinions about it, well, to what extent should you actually condition the transfer, the benefits to requesting particular behavior? In some contexts, we found also that without any condition, you still find the same positive behaviors. So, which gives rise to say, well, maybe it's not needed, as long as the type of transfer, the type of benefit fits the context to overcome constraints. So if poor people, their main constraint is a liquidity constraint to in situation of shock, so that they don't need that normally they might have taken the children from school, that just by having the transfer they would stop from doing that. So I think it's more about how you design the program as fit to the needs of the context, and whether cash transfers are better in one context or food distribution programs or public works programs, that may vary. Then the last part on how to influence agenda, it's complicated. Again, it depends a little bit on the program. Some programs are typically gender insensitive or may have adverse impact, like a lot of public works programs don't tend to be very suited to the conditions of women when they have children, have to take care of children, and when there's particular demands on their time because of the public works program they may have access to. So there you have to take additional measures to make them more gender sensitive. In most contexts, it works very well that making them more gender sensitive by just giving the women the benefits can make the difference. But then the context should also work, and there should be no other impediments. One example our Director General typically likes to give in his own experience when he was a minister in the government of Brazil and actually promoting the expansion of the cash transfer program also to women. He found that he actually had to change the constitution because women were not allowed to receive credits, let alone also and direct transfers from the government. So sometimes the context has to change, and also in other context, you have to also overcome other hurdles. But in general, what we found, if the women get more control of the resources, it's not just what I said, that they spend the money better, but it empowers them within the household. It gives them a new position in the household that may change their lives around and as much as for their families. So it's not it's not a panacea that if you do this, it will work the same way and is effective everywhere. You have to look carefully at each situation, but we do find that in most cases it helps empower women when they get hold of the benefits and through that can help improve the livelihoods of their families.
Thank you very much. Any questions, sir? Could you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you. Bob Burg, World Academy of Art and Science. I'm a minor student of courage in the multilateral system, and so gleaned a bit from being senior advisor to 4 parts of the UN. So I'm admiring you on social protection, a field that some had said belongs to the World Bank, and you have added richness to it. I think next year there may be another opportunity for courage, and I wanted to encourage you to think about the demand side and not just the supply side on reaction on climate. Unfortunately, the UN is a little silent these days about population planning, and also doesn't really speak too much about modifying consumer demand. And those are variables where country case studies could really illuminate what policymakers have as choices that can affect the severity of climate impact in their country. And I haven't seen, particularly on consumer behavior, that's a field that I just haven't seen. How do you modify dietary practices so that it's easier on the climate?
We'll take ma'am, second row.
Okay. Carla Rent from USAID. And I wanted to just get back to the earlier question and combine it with what you had just mentioned, which was designing social protection programs to be complementary with ag programs. And we do have one small nascent example in a program in Haiti that we have, which is a safety net program that utilizes food vouchers. And one of the reasons, despite some of the sort of the options that we had and the feelings that perhaps cash would be easier, our cash transfers are viewed in a better way, was that we insisted on still working with the government to institutionalize this safety net program using food vouchers, because we also wanted to increase demand for local production, locally produced food. And so we really have tied it to specific foods that are locally produced, including fresh vegetables, to try to change consumer demand for certain products. And because food insecurity is very, very closely linked to access and to poverty, we felt that it was a good way at getting at some of those aspects of improving access, but at the same time trying to improve demand for locally produced foods.
We'll take one more for the front row, yes.
Thank you very much. You mentioned here in coping with climate change in agriculture and specifically improving carbon and nitrogen management in agriculture. Could you elaborate specifically relating this to small farmers, small stakeholders? What are the issues you see there? And also, if you could mention about fertilizer, how does it relate to fertilizer and water purification? Thank you.
Given a whole lecture on each question, it's no, I think they're very good questions. Let's start with how to influence dietary practices. That's a very difficult thing to change, right? So first, linked to the social protection discussion, Dan also referred to that. When we look at the impacts on access to food, we see very strong impacts from social protection. Even in many cases also that nutrition intakes improves, but there's still a lot of parts of the population, particularly in children, where you don't see necessarily those impacts. So that's why we also now talk about how can we make social protection more nutrition sensitive by design. And one of the things that we come up with there is that maybe, but there may be other ways, but one of the things that seem to be working, if you have the right other elements into place, particularly combine it with nutrition education programs, with access to health programs, that's where the things have to come together, and then you may enhance it. To take before getting to the climate change discussion is that we've had also discussions on within our program on food waste and losses, right? So particularly food waste, as we call it, it's sort of that the food gets lost at the end of the food chain, and we talk more about food losses, which happen more closer to the post-harvest and pre-harvest production processes. We've talked about waste. It's a lot about how you can influence behavior at the end of the chain, so people don't buy more food than they actually need, and so on and so forth. But it's very difficult to influence that. It's like in the U.S. with Mayor. I lived in New York when Mayor Bloomberg tried to impose taxes on Coca-Cola and other soft drinks, which didn't work so well because politically it's a very difficult sell and also in practice difficult to implement. But I do think is that we should look at that side. If we don't make consumption sustainable as we want to make production sustainable, then it won't work. And also if it comes from both sides, then the change process is much quicker. And we will study it, so I can't give you a concrete answer how we will answer this question. So the simple answer would be is what the IPCC reports also say, if people would eat less animal protein and more plant-based protein and nutrients, that will have an enormous impact on emissions from agriculture. But it's not so easy to make this change, also given nutritional implications, but also just the behaviors people have. So that requires a lot of change among a lot of users. But I do think is that we must think about it, and I was going to say the analogy we had, I did for the UN report on climate change technologies and transformations more related to the energy sector. If you take energy transformations of energy systems, it typically takes about 75 to 100 years to make the change from steam to electricity and so on. And in all transitions in history, most change came from the push from the user end, not from the change, from the big pushes, big investments up front in the technology side. So it has to work from both sides to accelerate the process. So we'll look into it, but I'm not going to give you the answer yet to that question. Come back in October when we present the report. Then quickly on the other two questions, food vouchers versus cash transfers. It's a valid point. In India, they have a huge debate whether they should shift from their food distribution system, which is the mainstay, also to cash transfers. Most people still insist on the food distribution scheme. I think it depends on it. I think from what I said, we do see in particularly in the African context where we've done much of the research ourselves, we do see is that also the cash transfers have the same effect, that it does help local producers through the better risk management, through overcoming liquidity constraints and so on. So we do get this effect even without having to say we have to, as a government, we have to buy up the food and then hand it over as through vouchers to the poor population. So it depends, as I said, it depends a little bit on the context. I think in the end you would like to have a scheme which gives more choice to people how to make their decisions and through which they can improve their livelihoods moving forward. So as FAO, we're not against food vouchers, but I think if there's a context where you can clearly see that it's through a cash transfer, probably that's in those situations it may be as good as the food voucher, also to stimulate local food production. On carbon nitrogen management, well, that's a whole complex story, but to give one simple example is what is one of the main causes of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture is the manure that's left on the land and typically untreated, and through enteric fermentation, a lot of it coming from the animals. So if instead of just putting it liquid on the land or leaving it there, you treat it and you combine it with straw and other things, and then reuse it as fertilizer, then you reduce emissions, and you also reduce the necessity to rely on chemical fertilizers on the land, which both would help to better manage your nitrogen and your carbon. Just one example. There's many other examples, but the whole concept of climate smart agriculture is to look into that, how to better manage that, both from a better, more efficient use on the resource side and avoiding the emissions on the other hand, while at the same time improving productivity through adequate fertilizers and other inputs needed for productivity increases.
Dan, would you like to add anything?
So really briefly, just to echo Rob's response about behavior change and also transfer modalities. So with World Food Program, we did ran some experiments in multiple countries, comparing either cash and food transfers side by side in randomized experiments, or in one of the studies in Ecuador, we also had food vouchers as a third modality. And generally, I think Rob's got it about right. So the food rations, which tend to be relatively narrow in design, there are transaction costs to households of trying to convert that or substitute the income gain that's equivalent there to is not as easily substituted into other goods as it would be for cash or for vouchers. So in Ecuador, we found really large increases in calorie consumption from food rations, but a very weak effects on dietary diversity. Whereas food vouchers and cash both did well in that regard. So if it's important for policy reasons to stakeholders that those resources be spent on food, then maybe food vouchers is a better way to go, which still allow a pretty diverse diet. But I think the evidence is mounting to suggest that maybe we're not right to say that those resources that we should be tying the hands of households to make those resources be spent on food. If they see better needs to spend them elsewhere, they're probably right. We don't find a lot of dependency. We don't find a lot of expenditures on sort of ill goods and things like that. Households aren't spending on that now, and an extra cash transfer isn't going to change that behavior. On the behavior change component, we have some new research coming out of Bangladesh where when we twin nutrition behavior change and cash transfers, we actually, again, in a series of experiments with either food or cash transfers, either with or without nutrition behavior change. Multi-treatment arm design is very complicated, run with World Food Program. The only treatment arm that improved nutritional status, child nutritional status, was the cash plus BCC arm. When you gave households the information they needed to improve child nutrition and the resources to do it, they found a big 7 percentage point reduction in stunting prevalence among children. So that's a big deal. We're excited about those results.
We'll take 2 more questions, one in the front row here, and then we have an online question.
Thank you. I'm Karen Brooks. I'm the director of the CGIAR research program on policies, institutions, and markets. Dan gave a very nice advertisement for us, so thank you for that. But thank you both for really interesting and very useful remarks. I want to first echo Dan's thanks to FAO and for bringing out this SOFA now on social protection and agriculture, because just 6 months ago, maybe just 4 months ago, when we submitted our preliminary proposal for what we wanted to do with our program in the period 2017 to 2022, we had a big chunk of work on social protection, and the question we got back from our authorizing environment was, why should we do that? We're an agricultural organization. Why should we pay any attention to social protection? So of course we made our arguments and we prevailed, but it's wonderful to have this backup and this very strong statement of why social protection and agriculture really do fit together. And I think that the work that Dan described, where we'll learn more about the specific complementarities of agriculture and social protection, will be very, very helpful. But I think it will be especially helpful for helping us understand not only how to design programs so that we get agricultural growth out of the social protection, but also to understand the limits of that. Because I think there will be limits. We'll discover that there are many things that social protection programs could do to promote agricultural growth, and that will be very helpful for the climate change agenda, which was the second part of your proposal. But we'll find that it's not 100% complementarity. There will be limits, and so we'll still have to be managing the trade-offs. And most of the countries that are underinvesting in social protection are also underinvesting in agriculture and agricultural growth and managing climate change in agriculture. So these issues of where do we put the money if we have choices, I think will be really important for us to learn about through this, the research on social protection, complementarity with agriculture. So I look forward to lots of things that we'll do together.
We have an online question from Twitter, and they ask, are there any successful social protection programs that have encouraged youth to work in agriculture and so prevented migration?
Hi, I'm Roy Matthews. I'm with the Hunger Project, and I have a question about the program design implementation of social protection. So it's important to note that the ones that are affected by this issue of climate change and food insecurity are the ones on the ground. So is there any avenues for community planning and design in these programs? And where's their input and role in designing these programs as well? Thank you.
Okay, we'll stop there, and so we can wrap up in the next 5-6 minutes.
Yeah, well, thanks, Karen, for the supportive remarks. I agree, but I think on the limits, some of it is also in the report mentioned. Of course, if you give social protection benefits, right, it's not like, well, if you get a positive effect, and as by increasing more and more the benefits you get, there will be an end to that, right? But one of the things we also highlight in the report is that some of the effects don't materialize if not other things fall into place, right? Or if it doesn't meet the needs of the household. So, for instance, like the local economy effects, we also did a study in each of the cases we have to look, well, also similar, well, what if certain constraints would be binding? So some households, you see the effects, but then some households also labor constraints. So if they want to enhance their production, they have to either to enlarge their land. If they cannot enlarge their land, then maybe these production effects won't be happening, won't be materializing because of those kinds of constraints, or because they don't have more labor because of people have migrated away. So the point to make here is that one has to understand the limits, and also where this works and where it does not work. Right? Basically, what we're talking here about is situations where social protection have these effects among typically very poor rural households and in agricultural households. This is where the setting where we see it work. These production and risk coping mechanisms may work out quite differently in context where people also have other means to cope with risk. So it's actually responding to situations where there's very little else but then the social protection programs. That's where you see the strongest effect. So it's very important to keep that in mind. Where is it the prevented migration? Well, we've seen quite a bit of context, including context which I mentioned, where you see a positive impact on limiting particularly seasonal migration or what we call distress migration flows. Of course, social protection is not the only thing, but particularly where it tends to stimulate production and improve livelihoods, then also the pressure for out-migration to other rural areas or to cities reduces quite a bit. One of the strong effects is also the program which Dan mentioned, the Ethiopia program, where we see that particularly also when they start linking the cash transfer benefits to productive support programs. So it gave much more opportunities in the local economy to find a way. And that's, I also think, is that whether it's social protection or something else, if people can find better opportunities that suit them locally, then probably that's a very good policy to better manage migration flows. The role for community planning, yeah, in many cases this is very important. There's a lot of roles we have both, I think you mentioned climate change, but also for social protection, have involved communities is very, very important. And at FAO we have one program which actually is a social communication program, which brings villagers together through a small radio program, and it helps them inform them about benefits of government programs, also access to markets and to inputs. And we've seen that that's often served as a basis for better community organization, and also through that for better targeting of the social protection programs. Also think with climate change programs, I just mentioned in passing the role of communities, but also how communities are organized, how producers are organized, will be essential in how to adopt better practices in agriculture. If I make one pitch for a program we just started supporting in India, it's called the National Rural Livelihoods Mission, which is arguably the world's largest poverty reduction program. It's to cater for only 500 million people. And the interesting thing of that program, it's built on community organization to transform livelihoods. So it's a poverty reduction strategy that is built in the empowerment of the rural population. And as a starting point, they formed their own savings and loan cooperative, put that together in a village organization and at the district level. And then they have their own diffusion strategy to adopt new agricultural practices, which is all built around what we call integrated farming systems built on crop production together with livestock and multi-crop production, both to enhance food security, but also to use more climate smart techniques. And it's all built on the disseminations through the villagers themselves. And that's been proven to be very powerful. So they also go out to other places. So I'm somebody who very strongly believes in the empowerment and the good organization at the local level in order to effectuate these changes. And I think this program in India is a very interesting example to look at.
We've gone over a couple of minutes, but Dan, would you like to?
No, Rob gets the last word for sure.
Okay, all right. Okay, wonderful, great. Thank you very much for coming, everyone.